Welcome to Shadow Frames, where we uncover the stories hidden in the darkness. I'm your host, and today we're going to examine a rather peculiar photograph from 1888 that has recently surfaced in an old collection. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than a solemn funeral portrait, a common practice in the Victorian era. But upon closer inspection, experts have discovered something in the widow's shadow that defies explanation. The photograph in question was found in a collection of items from the estate of Nathaniel Montgomery, a wealthy businessman who died in 2019 at the age of 94. Among his possessions was a leather-bound album containing various daguerreotypes and early photographs, most dating from the late 19th century. The album had been passed down through generations of his family, with many of the subjects remaining unidentified. It was Montgomery's great-granddaughter, Eliza, who brought the album to the Historical Photography Society in Boston last year. She hoped they might help identify some of the people in the photographs, as she was compiling a family history. Little did she know that one particular image would capture the attention of photography experts worldwide. The photograph that concerns us today appears on page 17 of the album. It shows a funeral scene from 1888, a deceased man in his coffin surrounded by mourners dressed in black. At the head of the coffin stands a woman, presumably his widow, wearing a black veil that cascades down her face and shoulders. The setting is a Victorian parlor, with heavy drapes drawn and ornate furniture pushed aside to accommodate the coffin. The lighting comes from several candles placed around the room, casting long shadows across the floor and walls. When the photograph first arrived at the Society, it was examined by Dr. Helen Blackwood, a specialist in Victorian post-mortem photography. Post-mortem photography was a common practice in the 19th century, when photographs were expensive and rare. For many families, a funeral might provide the only opportunity to have an image of a loved one. These memento mori, as they were known, served as keepsakes for the bereaved. Dr. Blackwood has dedicated her career to studying these historical photographs, finding in them not just macabre curiosity but profound insights into how our ancestors confronted mortality. The Victorian era's relationship with death was markedly different from our own. More intimate, more ritualized, and in many ways more honest. Death was not hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes, but occurred within the home, with family members often participating in the preparation of the body. These photographs tell us so much about Victorian attitudes toward death, Dr. Blackwood often explains to her students. They didn't shy away from it as we do today. Death was a constant companion, particularly for families with young children, given the high infant mortality rates. These memorial portraits were a way of preserving the memory of loved ones and acknowledging their passage as part of the natural order. The album Eliza Montgomery brought to the Society contained several typical post-mortem photographs: infants posed as if sleeping, elderly relatives in repose, family groups gathered around a coffin. But the photograph on page 17 stood out immediately to Dr. Blackwood's trained eye. The quality was exceptional, she noted. Many funeral photographs from this period are somewhat blurry or poorly composed due to the limitations of early photography and the emotional state of those present. But this one was remarkably clear and deliberately arranged. Dr. Blackwood noted several interesting features about the photograph. First, the quality was exceptional for its time, suggesting it was taken by a professional photographer using the latest equipment. Second, the composition was unusually complex, with the mourners arranged in a semicircle around the coffin and the widow standing slightly apart. And third, there was something strange about the widow's shadow. While the shadows of the other mourners fell in a pattern consistent with the candle lighting, the widow's shadow appeared distorted. It stretched across the floor and up the wall behind her, much longer and darker than it should have been. But what truly caught Dr. Blackwood's attention was a distinct shape within that shadow, a shape that didn't correspond to the widow's silhouette. Dr. Blackwood immediately called in her colleague, Dr. James Harrington, an expert in photographic analysis and authentication. Together, they subjected the photograph to a series of tests to rule out any tampering or photographic anomalies. Dr. Harrington had spent decades developing techniques to identify fraudulent photographs. His work had helped debunk numerous hoaxes and authenticated countless historical images. A former forensic photographer for the Boston Police Department, he had transitioned to academic work in his 50s, bringing his meticulous attention to detail and skeptical mindset to the study of historical photography. At first, I thought it might be a double exposure, Dr. Harrington explained. That was a common error in early photography. but the rest of the image is crisp and clear, with no signs of double exposure anywhere else. Photography in the late 19th century was still a relatively new technology, fraught with technical challenges. Exposure times had shortened considerably since the medium's invention, but they were still long enough that subjects needed to remain perfectly still to avoid blurring. The chemicals used in the development process were sensitive to numerous factors, including temperature and light conditions. Mistakes and anomalies were common. Double exposure, where a photographic plate is exposed twice before being developed, resulting in two superimposed images, was among the most common errors. It was also a technique deliberately employed by fraudulent spirit photographers who claimed to capture images of the deceased alongside their living relatives. But the anomaly in the widow's shadow bore none of the hallmarks of double exposure. The rest of the photograph showed no ghost images or overlapping forms. The widow herself was in perfect focus, her black mourning attire crisp against the lighter background of the wall. The next step was to digitize the image and enhance it using specialized software. This is when the true nature of the anomaly became apparent. Within the widow's shadow, clearly visible when the contrast was adjusted, was the silhouette of a tall, slender figure standing behind her. But, in the actual photograph, there was no one standing in that position. The space behind the widow was empty, save for the heavy drapes covering the windows. "We checked for any physical explanation," Dr. Blackwood said. "Could it be a mannequin or coat stand that was captured in the shadow but obscured in the image? Could it be a flaw in the photographic plate?" But none of these explanations held up under scrutiny. Dr. Harrington conducted a series of experiments, recreating the lighting conditions visible in the photograph using period-appropriate candles and modern replicas of Victorian furniture. He positioned a model in the same stance as the widow and photographed her shadow from various angles. No matter how he arranged the scene, he could not produce a shadow that contained a secondary figure like the one in the Caldwell photograph. "The laws of optics simply don't allow for this kind of anomaly," he concluded. "A shadow is essentially the absence of light. It can be distorted by the surface it falls on or by multiple light sources, but it cannot contain details that aren't present in the object casting it." Further analysis revealed even more disturbing details. The figure in the shadow appeared to be reaching out toward the widow with one arm extended. And though it's difficult to discern features in a shadow, the shape of the head seemed unnaturally elongated. Dr. Harrington employed specialized imaging software to enhance this detail. By adjusting the contrast and applying various filters, he was able to extract more information from the shadow figure. "What's remarkable is the distinctiveness of the form," he noted. "This isn't just a vague blob that could be interpreted in multiple ways. The silhouette has clear anatomical features: arms, legs, a head, but the proportions are wrong. The arms are too long relative to the body, and the head is elongated in a way that doesn't correspond to any human profile I've ever seen." With no scientific explanation forthcoming, Dr. Blackwood turned to the historical record. Who were these people in the photograph, and what might have been happening in their lives at the time it was taken? The back of the photograph bore only a date, April 18, 1888, and the name of a photography studio, Hammond & Sons, Boston. With these limited clues, Dr. Blackwood began her investigation. Boston in the late 19th century was a city of stark contrasts. The elegant homes of Beacon Hill and the newly created Back Bay neighborhood housed the city's elite, old money families whose wealth came from shipping and trade, and newer industrialists who had made their fortunes in manufacturing and railroads. These privileged few lived in remarkable proximity to areas of desperate poverty, where immigrants and factory workers crowded into tenements with inadequate sanitation and limited access to clean water. The Hammond & Sons photography studio was well known in late 19th century Boston. Founded by William Hammond in 1862, it specialized in portrait photography for the city's elite. By 1888, the business was run by William's sons, Thomas and Edward Hammond. The Hammond studio was located on Tremont Street, in a fashionable shopping district frequented by Boston's upper class. The storefront featured a glass display window where sample portraits were exhibited to attract customers. Inside, the waiting area was decorated with plush furniture and elegant wallpaper, designed to put clients at ease and reinforce the studio's reputation for quality and taste. Beyond the waiting area was the photography room itself, equipped with the latest cameras and lighting apparatus. Backdrops and props were available for different types of portraits. classical columns and painted landscapes for formal images, rustic fences and artificial flowers for more pastoral scenes. A search through the studio's records, now housed in the Boston Historical Society, revealed an appointment on April 18, 1888, for a funeral service, Caldwell residence. This led Dr. Blackwood to search for death records in Boston for the days preceding that date. She found that on April 15, 1888, a Jonathan Caldwell had died at the age of 45. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. Jonathan was a prominent banker and investor, known for his shrewd business dealings and considerable fortune. He left behind a widow, Elizabeth, who was only 28 at the time of his death. With these names in hand, Dr. Blackwood was able to piece together more of the story. The Caldwells had been married for just over a year when Jonathan died. It was a second marriage for him. His first wife, Margaret, had died in 1885 after a long illness. Elizabeth had been working as a nurse in the Caldwell household, caring for the ailing Margaret. After Margaret's death, Elizabeth stayed on as a companion to Jonathan, and they were married less than a year later. The marriage had raised eyebrows in Boston society. The age difference was notable, but more scandalous was Elizabeth's background. She was not from a prominent family, and rumors swirled about her intentions. Some suggested she had deliberately ingratiated herself with the wealthy widower, while others hinted at an even darker motive. Victorian society operated under rigid class distinctions, and marriages across these boundaries were viewed with suspicion, particularly when they involved a significant disparity in wealth. For a nurse to marry her employer was seen as a breach of proper boundaries. That Elizabeth was young and attractive only added fuel to the gossip. Dr. Blackwood discovered a newspaper article from the Boston Daily Chronicle dated April 16, 1888, which mentioned Jonathan's death and included a brief statement from the family physician, Dr. Samuel Warren. According to Dr. Warren, Jonathan had been in perfect health until the evening of his death, when he suddenly collapsed during dinner. Despite Dr. Warren's efforts, Jonathan could not be revived. The article also noted that Jonathan had recently changed his will, leaving the bulk of his estate to his young widow rather than to his children from his first marriage. This had caused a rift in the family, with Jonathan's eldest son, William, publicly denouncing his father's decision. With this information, a potential narrative began to emerge. Could Elizabeth have had a hand in Jonathan's death? And if so, could the strange figure in the shadow be somehow connected to this possible crime? To delve deeper into the mystery, Dr. Blackwood traveled to Boston to visit the former Caldwell residence, which still stands in the city's Back Bay neighborhood. Now divided into luxury apartments, the building's original architecture remains largely intact. The Back Bay was created in the mid-19th century by filling in a marshy basin of the Charles River, creating a planned neighborhood of elegant townhouses arranged along a grid of wide streets. The Caldwell residence was a 4-story brownstone on Commonwealth Avenue, the grandest boulevard in the area, with a tree-lined central mall inspired by Parisian boulevards. The building's facade featured the typical elements of Victorian architecture: a high stoop leading to the entrance, bay windows, and elaborate stonework around the doors and windows. Inside, the original floor plan had been altered to accommodate multiple apartments, but many architectural details remained: marble fireplaces, crown moldings, and intricate parquet floors. With permission from the current owners, Dr. Blackwood was able to examine the parlor where the funeral photograph was likely taken. The room's dimensions and window placements matched those visible in the photograph, confirming the location. Standing in that space, I had the strangest feeling, Dr. Blackwood later recounted. It was as if the room remembered what had happened there, even after all these years. I found myself looking at the wall where the shadow figure had appeared, half expecting to see it again. While in Boston, Dr. Blackwood also visited the Massachusetts State Archives, where she found additional information about the Caldwell family. Jonathan's first wife, Margaret, had come from a wealthy family herself, and their marriage had united 2 substantial fortunes. They had 3 children: William, born in 1866, Catherine, born in 1869, and Robert, born in 1872. Margaret Caldwell had been a prominent figure in Boston society, known for her charitable work and refined taste. Newspaper accounts described her as a gracious hostess and devoted mother. Her decline and death had been extensively covered in local papers, with detailed reports of her symptoms and the various treatments attempted by Dr. Warren and several consulting physicians. After Margaret's death in 1885, Jonathan had become increasingly reclusive, rarely leaving the house except for business matters. He hired Elizabeth Blackwood, no relation to Dr. Helen Blackwood, as a nurse during Margaret's illness, and she remained in the household afterward. Elizabeth had trained at Massachusetts General Hospital's nursing school, one of the first formal nursing programs in the country. Hospital records indicated that she had been a capable student, though there were notes about her ambitious nature and desire to improve her station in life. Dr. Blackwood was intrigued by a statement in Margaret's death certificate. The cause of death was listed as wasting disease, but a note from Dr. Warren mentioned symptoms that had baffled him: extreme fatigue, hair loss, and bluish lines on the gums. To a modern medical professional, these symptoms suggest heavy metal poisoning, possibly arsenic or lead. Arsenic poisoning was not uncommon in the Victorian era, when the toxic substance was found in numerous household products, wallpaper, fabric dyes, cosmetics, and even some medicines. But it was also a well-known poison, easily administered in small doses over time to produce a gradual decline that mimicked natural illness. Could Elizabeth have poisoned Margaret as well? And if so, why did she use a different method for Jonathan? The investigation took another turn when Dr. Blackwood located the descendants of Catherine Caldwell, Jonathan's daughter. Catherine had married a man named Howard Peterson in 1892, and their grandchildren still lived in the Boston area. Catherine's granddaughter, Susan Peterson, agreed to meet with Dr. Blackwood. Now in her 70s, Susan had heard family stories about the wicked stepmother who had allegedly murdered her great-grandfather. Susan Peterson lived in a comfortable townhouse in Cambridge, filled with family heirlooms and photographs spanning generations. Among her possessions were several items that had belonged to the Caldwell family: a silver tea service, a collection of leather-bound books, and a portrait of Catherine as a young woman. "My grandmother never believed it was natural causes," Susan told Dr. Blackwood. She was convinced that Elizabeth had poisoned her father to get his money, but they couldn't prove anything, and Elizabeth was very clever. She played the part of the grieving widow perfectly. According to Susan, Catherine had been devastated by her father's death, coming so soon after losing her mother. She had never trusted Elizabeth, sensing something calculating beneath the nurse's sympathetic manner. When Jonathan announced his intention to marry Elizabeth, Catherine had pleaded with him to reconsider, but he dismissed her concerns as jealousy. After Jonathan's death, relations between Elizabeth and her stepchildren deteriorated rapidly. The change in the will led to a protracted legal battle, with William challenging the document's validity on the grounds that his father had been unduly influenced. The courts ultimately upheld the will, leaving Elizabeth in control of the majority of the Caldwell fortune. Susan also revealed that after Jonathan's death, Elizabeth had lived a surprisingly modest life. Despite inheriting a considerable fortune, she moved to a small house on the outskirts of Boston and rarely socialized. She never remarried and died in 1927, nearly 40 years after Jonathan. "The strange thing," Susan added, "is that my grandmother always said Elizabeth seemed afraid of something. She would never go out after dark, and she kept every room in her house brightly lit, even at night. She was especially terrified of shadows." This peculiar detail caught Dr. Blackwood's attention. Could Elizabeth's fear of shadows be connected to whatever appears in the funeral photograph? Fear of shadows, or sciophobia, is a recognized phobia, though relatively rare. It is often associated with nyctophobia, fear of darkness, or lygophobia, fear of dim light. In most cases, these fears develop from traumatic experiences or as manifestations of more general anxiety disorders. But Elizabeth's specific terror of shadows, rather than darkness in general, suggested something more targeted. Dr. Blackwood's next step was to locate Elizabeth's personal papers, if any existed. After her death, Elizabeth's modest estate had been left to a local church, which used the funds to establish a small library. Dr. Blackwood visited this library, hoping to find some record of Elizabeth's life after Jonathan's death. The Church of St. Michael's stood on a quiet street in Dorchester, a Boston neighborhood that had been a separate town until its annexation in 1870. The church itself was a modest Gothic revival structure, built in the 1860s to serve a growing community of middle-class families. The library occupied a small building adjacent to the church, originally constructed as a parish hall. To her surprise, the library still had a collection of books that had belonged to Elizabeth, as well as a small box of personal items. Among these was a journal, kept sporadically from 1888 to 1926, the year before Elizabeth's death. The journal was a small, leather-bound volume with marbled end papers and thin, yellowed pages covered in a tight, precise handwriting. Many pages had been torn out, suggesting that Elizabeth had removed entries she didn't want others to read. What remained was fragmentary, but revealing. The journal's early entries, written shortly after Jonathan's death, are filled with grief and remorse. Elizabeth writes of her love for Jonathan and her despair at his sudden passing. There is no hint of foul play or ulterior motive in these passages. April 20th, 1888. I cannot believe he is gone. My dearest Jay, who brought such joy to my life after so many years of hardship. They all look at me with suspicion, particularly W. But they cannot know the depth of my love for Jay. I would have given anything to save him that night. Anything. April 25th, 1888. The lawyers have read the will, and as Jay promised, he has provided for me generously. Bew was furious, shouting accusations that made my blood run cold. If only he knew how little I care for the money. I would trade every penny to have Jay back with me, to feel his hand in mine once more. These early entries portray Elizabeth as a genuinely grieving widow, not a calculating murderess. But as the journal continues, a different narrative emerges. Elizabeth begins to write about strange occurrences in the Caldwell house, cold spots, unexplained noises, and a persistent feeling of being watched. She describes how she would catch glimpses of a tall figure standing in the corners of rooms, visible only in her peripheral vision. When she turned to look directly, the figure would vanish. May 10th, 1888. I cannot shake the feeling that I am not alone in this house. Last night, as I was reading in the library, I distinctly felt someone standing behind my chair. I turned, expecting to see one of the servants, but there was no one there. Yet the sensation of a presence remained. May 15th, 1888. The servants are beginning to notice it too. Mary, the upstairs maid, gave notice today, saying she could not work in a house where things move by themselves. I tried to convince her she was imagining things, but then she described exactly what I have been experiencing. The cold spots, the sense of being followed, the strange shadows that seem to move independently of their sources. Most disturbing are her descriptions of the shadows. She writes that in the evenings, as the gas lamps were lit, the shadows in the house seemed to move independently of their sources. And in her own shadow, she sometimes saw another shape, a tall, slender figure with long arms and an oddly elongated head. May 21st, 1888. It happened again tonight. As I was preparing for bed, I noticed my shadow on the wall, but it was not alone. Within it, I could see another form, like a person standing behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the wall, my shadow was my own again. Am I losing my mind? June 2nd, 1888. I cannot endure another night in this house. Today, as I was descending the stairs, I saw my shadow fall on the wall beside me, and within it was that same terrible figure, keeping pace with me step for step. What is happening to me? Is it grief that causes these hallucinations? Or is there something in this house, something connected to Jay's death, that will not let me rest? These experiences became so terrifying that Elizabeth sold the Caldwell mansion just 3 months after Jonathan's death, accepting far less than its market value in her haste to leave. She moved to a small house with large windows and few trees around it, minimizing the shadows. The house Elizabeth chose was in Dorchester, then a streetcar suburb that allowed middle-class residents to commute to jobs in downtown Boston. It was a modest colonial revival structure, with none of the ornate details or dark corners of the Caldwell mansion. The lot was clear of trees, allowing sunlight to flood the property during daylight hours. But even there, she was not free from the phenomenon. In an entry dated December 12, 1888, she writes, "It has followed me here. Last night, as I was preparing for bed, I saw it again, that dreadful shape within my shadow, reaching for me with its long, grasping fingers. I cried out and dropped the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. In that moment of blackness, I felt its cold touch upon my shoulder. I cannot endure this much longer. What does it want from me? Why does it torment me so?" Elizabeth's journal becomes increasingly erratic after this point. She writes of sleeping only during daylight hours and keeping her home ablaze with lamps throughout the night. She describes consulting with spiritualists and mediums, seeking some explanation for the haunting presence. Spiritualism had reached the height of its popularity in the late 19th century, with mediums claiming to communicate with the dead through seances, automatic writing, and various forms of divination. While many were frauds, preying on the bereaved with elaborate hoaxes, others may have genuinely believed in their abilities. Boston had a thriving spiritualist community, with several prominent mediums offering their services to both the elite and middle classes. Elizabeth appears to have consulted with several of these individuals, seeking answers to her supernatural experiences. One medium, a Madame Zabrina, reportedly told Elizabeth that she was being followed by a shadow person, an entity that existed in the space between the living and the dead, and which attached itself to those who had cheated death in some way. February 18, 1889, Madame Z claims that the entity following me is neither ghost nor demon but something she calls a shadow person. She says these beings exist in the darkness between worlds and are drawn to those who have disrupted the natural order of life and death. When I asked what she meant, she fixed me with a penetrating stare and said, "You know what you have done." I left at once, shaken to my core. Another entry, dated March 3, 1889, suggests that Elizabeth may have begun to understand the nature of the entity. I dreamt of Margaret last night. She stood at the foot of my bed, her face gaunt as it was in her final days, but her eyes clear and knowing. She said nothing, merely pointed to the corner of the room where the shadow stood watching. When I awoke, I understood at last. It is not Jonathan who haunts me, but something far older and more terrible. Something that Margaret unwittingly invited in during her long illness and which has now fixed its attention upon me. These passages seem to imply that Elizabeth believed the entity had originally been associated with Margaret, Jonathan's first wife. But how? And why would it have transferred its attention to Elizabeth? Dr. Blackwood found a possible answer in the later pages of the journal. In an entry from 1903, 15 years after Jonathan's death, Elizabeth makes a shocking confession. "I can bear this burden no longer, even if only these pages hear my confession. It was I who hastened Margaret's end, adding small doses of arsenic to her medicine to release her from her suffering, or so I told myself. In truth, I had already developed feelings for Jonathan, and I convinced myself that Margaret, in her pain, would welcome death. But it was a terrible sin, and one that has brought a terrible punishment, for in tampering with the boundary between life and death, I opened a door for it to enter our world, and now it will never leave me in peace." This confession, if true, changes the entire narrative. Elizabeth admits to poisoning Margaret, though she frames it as an act of mercy. But she says nothing about Jonathan's death. Was that truly from natural causes, as the death certificate stated, or was there more to the story? Arsenic was readily available in the Victorian era, found in rat poison, fly papers, and certain cosmetics. As a nurse, Elizabeth would have had knowledge of its effects and access to sources. The symptoms described in Margaret's medical records, gradual weakening, hair loss, digestive distress, are consistent with chronic arsenic poisoning. Dr. Blackwood returned to the funeral photograph, examining it with new eyes. The figure in the shadow, could it be connected to Margaret's death rather than Jonathan's? Could it be, as Elizabeth's journal suggests, some kind of supernatural entity drawn to those who interfere with the natural process of death? To gain another perspective, Dr. Blackwood consulted with Professor Marcus Chen, an anthropologist specializing in death rituals and supernatural beliefs across cultures. Professor Chen pointed out that the concept of shadow entities, or shadow people, exists in folklore around the world. In many traditions, he explained, shadows are seen as a manifestation of the soul or life force. To interfere with someone's shadow is to interfere with their essence. There are beliefs that certain entities can attach themselves to a person's shadow, gradually draining their life force. From ancient Egypt to modern Japan, the shadow has been viewed as an extension of the self, a manifestation of the soul or life essence. In some African cultures, the shadow is considered one of several souls that make up a complete person. Damage to the shadow, by stepping on it, cutting it, or allowing it to fall on certain forbidden places, is believed to cause harm to the person. European folklore contains numerous references to deals with the devil in which the shadow is forfeit, the most famous being the story of Peter Schlemihl, who sells his shadow to the devil and subsequently finds himself shunned by society, as the lack of a shadow marks him as soulless. Professor Chen also noted the significance of photography in relation to these beliefs. In the early days of photography, many cultures were deeply suspicious of the camera's ability to capture a person's image, and by extension, part of their soul. The Victorian era's fascination with post-mortem photography created an interesting intersection between technology and spiritual beliefs. When photography was first introduced to indigenous cultures around the world, it was often met with fear and resistance. The idea that a machine could create a perfect likeness was seen as supernatural in itself. Some believed that having one's photograph taken would result in the loss of part of the soul, leading to illness or death. Even in Western society, where the scientific principles behind photography were understood, there remained a sense of the uncanny about the medium. The camera's ability to capture a moment in time, to preserve the image of the dead, seemed to blur the boundary between life and death in a way that both fascinated and disturbed Victorian sensibilities. This cultural context adds another layer to the mystery of the funeral photograph. Could the camera have captured something that was normally invisible to the naked eye? Something that existed in the liminal space between the living and the dead? Dr. Blackwood's investigation took yet another turn when she examined Elizabeth's death certificate. Elizabeth died on November 15, 1927, at the age of 67. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, the same as Jonathan's, but a note from the attending physician mentioned that Elizabeth had been found in her home, which had been illuminated by dozens of candles and lamps, as if she had been trying to banish every shadow from the premises. The physician, Dr. Thomas Garrett, had been called to Elizabeth's home by a concerned neighbor who had noticed that her curtains remained drawn well into the morning, contrary to her usual habits. Upon entering the house with the help of a local constable, they found Elizabeth's body in her bedroom. The physician also noted that Elizabeth's face showed an expression of extreme terror and that her body was found pressed against a wall, as if she had been backing away from something in the center of the room. Dr. Garrett's notes, preserved in the city's medical archives, described the scene in clinical but evocative terms. Subject found deceased in upper chamber of residence, apparently having been dead for approximately 10 to 12 hours. Body was found in unusual position, pressed against the north wall of the room, with arms outstretched as if warding off an attacker. Facial muscles frozen in expression of extreme terror. No signs of physical assault or struggle evident. Room contained 47 candles and 8 oil lamps, all extinguished. Cause of death appears to be cardiac arrest, possibly induced by extreme fear or shock. No previous history of heart disease noted. These details suggest that whatever had haunted Elizabeth throughout her life may have finally claimed her in the end. But the question remains, what exactly was it? To answer this question, Dr. Blackwood turned to the photograph itself once more. Using the most advanced imaging technology available, she and Dr. Harrington created an enhanced version of the shadow figure. The process involved digitizing the original photograph at an extremely high resolution, then using specialized software to isolate the shadow area. By adjusting contrast, brightness, and other parameters, they were able to extract more detail from what initially appeared to be a uniform darkness. The results were startling. The figure in the shadow was indeed humanoid, but with proportions that seemed subtly wrong. Arms too long, head too elongated, and when they looked closely at where the face should be, they found not features but a blank void, darker than the surrounding shadow. It's as if the figure is wearing the shadow like a cloak, Dr. Harrington observed, or perhaps more accurately, as if the shadow is a window through which it's emerging. This description aligns with accounts of shadow people in various paranormal traditions, entities that exist primarily in the dark and can only be glimpsed in peripheral vision or, apparently, captured by the unique properties of early photographic processes. But the most chilling discovery came when Dr. Blackwood had the photograph examined under ultraviolet light. This technique can sometimes reveal details not visible to the naked eye, especially in old photographs where the chemical compounds have degraded over time. Under UV light, a faint inscription became visible in the lower right corner of the photograph. Written in a small, precise hand, it read, "She sees it now, too." The handwriting matched samples of Jonathan Caldwell's signature from legal documents. But Jonathan was dead when this photograph was taken. How could he have written this inscription? Unless, of course, the photograph had been taken before his death and the funeral scene had been staged. This possibility led Dr. Blackwood back to the Hammond & Sons photography studio records. A more thorough examination revealed something she had missed before. There was indeed an appointment with the Caldwell family on April 18, 1888, 3 days after Jonathan's reported death. But there was also an appointment on April 10th, just 5 days before he died, for a private portrait session J. Caldwell. Could Jonathan have visited the photography studio less than a week before his death? And if so, why? What was the purpose of this private session? Dr. Blackwood found a possible answer in Elizabeth's journal. In an entry dated April 11, 1888, Elizabeth writes, "Jay returned from the city in a state of great agitation today. He would not tell me where he had been or what had upset him so, but he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to see someone there. At dinner, he asked me the strangest question, 'Elizabeth, do you ever feel as though you're being watched?' I assured him that we were quite alone, but he shook his head and said, 'Not by anyone living. He has taken to carrying a small mirror with him, which he uses to look behind him when he thinks I'm not noticing.'" This entry suggests that Jonathan was already experiencing something unusual the day after his visit to the photography studio. Could he have seen something in a photograph taken during that session? Perhaps the same shadow figure that later appeared in the funeral photograph? Dr. Blackwood hypothesized that Jonathan may have become aware of the entity and somehow connected it to Elizabeth. The inscription, "She sees it now too," could indicate that he knew the entity would transfer its attention to Elizabeth after his death. But this still doesn't explain how Jonathan could have written on the funeral photograph if he was already dead when it was taken. Unless, of course, the body in the coffin wasn't Jonathan's. This shocking possibility led Dr. Blackwood to seek permission for an exhumation of Jonathan Caldwell's grave. After a lengthy legal process, the exhumation was finally approved and carried out in September 2024. The Caldwell family plot was located in Mount Auburn Cemetery, America's first garden cemetery, established in 1831. The 175-acre grounds featured winding paths, ornamental ponds, and impressive funerary sculptures. The Caldwell monument was a substantial granite obelisk, with individual family members buried around it. The exhumation process was conducted with great care and respect, under the supervision of forensic anthropologists and medical examiners. The coffin, when finally revealed, was a high-quality hardwood casket with brass fittings, typical of burials for wealthy individuals in the Victorian era. The coffin contained a male body, badly decomposed but still identifiable through dental records as Jonathan Caldwell. However, the autopsy revealed something unexpected, traces of a powerful sedative in the preserved tissue samples. This suggests that Jonathan may have been drugged before his death, contrary to the heart failure diagnosis. Furthermore, the autopsy found no evidence of the typical changes that occur in the heart muscle after a heart attack. In fact, Jonathan's heart appeared to have been in excellent condition, making the official cause of death questionable. So if Jonathan was drugged, who administered the substance? The obvious suspect would be Elizabeth, who, as a former nurse, would have had knowledge of and access to such medications. But why would she do this, only to then be haunted by a shadow entity for the rest of her life? The answer may lie in the final pages of Elizabeth's journal. In an entry dated just 3 months before her death in 1927, she writes, "Nearly 40 years have passed since that terrible night, and still it has not left me. I know now that it will never leave, not until it has taken everything from me as I took everything from them." Jay knew. Somehow he knew what I had done to M and what I planned to do to him. That last week, he changed. He would stare at me with knowing eyes, and once I caught him writing something on the back of a photograph, though he hid it away before I could see what it was. The night I put the powder in his wine, just before he drank it, he smiled at me and said, "It's already here, Elizabeth. It's been here since M died, and now it will be with you." I thought it was just the rambling of a man who suspected his wife of treachery. How could I have known he spoke the truth? How could I have known what would be waiting for me in the shadows after he was gone? This confession, if accurate, confirms that Elizabeth murdered both Margaret and Jonathan Caldwell. It also suggests that Jonathan was aware of both murders before his death, and perhaps even aware of the shadow entity that had attached itself to their household. But how did Jonathan know about the entity? And how did he manage to write on a photograph that was taken after his death? The answer may lie in the private portrait session Jonathan attended on April 10, 1888. Dr. Blackwood theorized that during this session, the photographer might have captured an image of the shadow entity near Jonathan. Seeing this, Jonathan could have realized that something supernatural was present in his home, possibly connected to his first wife's death. He might then have planned a macabre form of revenge. Knowing or suspecting that Elizabeth intended to poison him, he could have arranged with the photographer to create a special funeral portrait after his death, one that would capture the shadow entity now attached to Elizabeth. The inscription, "She sees it now too," would then be his posthumous message to his murderer, informing her that the same entity that had haunted him in his final days would now be her constant companion. This theory explains the unusual quality and composition of the funeral photograph. It wasn't simply a standard memento mori, but a carefully orchestrated scene designed to capture the supernatural entity that Jonathan believed was present. But what exactly was this entity? Was it truly the spirit of Margaret, as Elizabeth seemed to believe at one point? Or was it something else entirely? Some kind of supernatural predator that was drawn to those who interfered with the natural boundary between life and death? To explore this question, Dr. Blackwood consulted with various experts in paranormal phenomena and religious studies. While opinions varied widely, several scholars pointed to ancient beliefs in entities that feed on human suffering and death. Dr. Eliza Merriweather, a folklorist specializing in supernatural beliefs across cultures, noted striking similarities between the entity described in Elizabeth's journal and various mythological beings. In Japanese folklore, there's a concept called ikiryo, a spirit that can leave a living person's body and haunt or harm others. Dr. Merriweather explained, it's often associated with intense emotions like jealousy, hatred, or the desire for revenge. Margaret, even if she wasn't conscious of it, might have generated such a spirit during her slow, painful death, especially if she suspected foul play. Other cultures have similar concepts: the European doppelganger, the Egyptian ka, the Norse fylgja, spirits or doubles that can separate from a living person and act independently. But what's interesting about this case, Dr. Merriweather continued, is that the entity seems to have attached itself not to a person, but to an action, the act of murder. It transferred from Margaret's death to Jonathan's, and then remained with Elizabeth, the person responsible for both deaths. In some traditions, these entities are thought to be attracted to places where unnatural deaths have occurred, or to people who have caused such deaths. They attach themselves to their victims, gradually draining their life force and driving them to despair. This description matches Elizabeth's experience as detailed in her journal. Over the nearly 40 years between Jonathan's death and her own, she describes a gradual deterioration of her physical and mental health. She writes of constant fatigue, paranoia, and a feeling of being hollowed out from within. July 17, 1902. I am merely a shell now, going through the motions of living. It watches me constantly, feeding on my fear, my guilt, my very essence. I have not had a full night's sleep in years. Even in daylight it is there, lurking at the edge of my vision. The doctors call it neurasthenia and prescribe rest cures and tonics, but they cannot treat what they cannot see. They cannot drive out what has become a part of me. December 25th, 1915, Christmas Day, and I am alone as always. The few acquaintances I once had have long since stopped calling. They sense something wrong in this house, in me. Children cross to the other side of the street when they pass my gate. Dogs growl when I approach. Even plants wither when I tend them. It is as if it spreads its taint through me to everything I touch. In her final journal entry, dated November 10, 1927, just 5 days before her death, Elizabeth writes, "It is standing beside me as I write these words, no longer hiding in the shadows, but bold in its hunger. I can feel its cold breath on my neck, its long fingers hovering just above my shoulder. The candles no longer keep it at bay. The light seems to pass through it now, as if it has grown stronger over these long years of feeding on my fear. Tonight I will make one last attempt to escape it. I have obtained a strong sedative from the pharmacy, enough to ensure I will never wake. Perhaps in death, I will finally be free of its presence. Or perhaps, as I now fear, it will follow me even beyond the grave." This final entry suggests that Elizabeth may have taken her own life to escape the entity, an escape that, according to the attending physician's notes, was unsuccessful. The description of her body found pressed against a wall, face frozen in terror, implies that in her final moments, the entity had finally closed in for its ultimate consumption. The funeral photograph, then, captures not just a moment in time, but the beginning of a decades-long supernatural punishment, a shadow entity attaching itself to a murderer, slowly consuming her over the course of a lifetime. But the most disturbing aspect of this case emerged when Dr. Blackwood made one final discovery. In the process of researching the Hammond and Sons photography studio, she found that Edward Hammond, one of the sons who ran the business in 1888, had written a memoir late in his life. This memoir, privately published and largely forgotten, contained a brief passage about the Caldwell funeral photograph. Of all the photographs I took in my long career, none has haunted me more than the funeral portrait of Jonathan Caldwell in April of 1888. The widow, Elizabeth, insisted on a particular arrangement of the mourners and specific lighting conditions, which struck me as odd at the time. After developing the plate, I noticed an unusual shadow behind her, a shadow that resembled a tall figure reaching toward her. When I pointed this out, she seemed not surprised but resigned, as if she had expected something of the sort. She paid for the photograph but asked me never to make copies or display it. As I handed her the finished portrait, she looked me directly in the eye and said, "It isn't just in the photograph, Mr. Hammond. It's here with us now." I felt a distinct chill at her words, and after she left, I could not shake the feeling that I was being observed by unseen eyes. In the decades since, I have occasionally felt that same sensation of being watched, especially in darkened rooms. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I glimpse a tall, slender shape standing just beyond the reach of the light. I have often wondered if, in capturing that shadow in the Caldwell photograph, I somehow invited it into my own life as well. This passage suggests that the entity may have affected not just Elizabeth, but anyone who came into contact with the photograph. Could the act of capturing the entity on film have somehow strengthened it or extended its reach? Edward Hammond's life after 1888 took a troubling turn. He left the family photography business in 1890, citing health reasons. His subsequent endeavors, a publishing venture, an import business, all failed within a few years. His marriage ended in divorce, unusual for the time, with his wife claiming that he had become obsessed with shadows and would spend hours staring at blank walls. Hammond died in 1926, just a year before Elizabeth, having spent his final decade in a private sanatorium. The attending physician's notes describe a patient suffering from acute melancholia with paranoid features, specifically an irrational fear of his own shadow. One nurse's report mentions finding Hammond pressed into a corner of his room, eyes fixed on the opposite wall, whispering, "It's getting closer." This possibility raises troubling questions about the photograph's journey through time, from Edward Hammond to the Caldwell family descendants, to Nathaniel Montgomery, whose estate contained the album, and now to Dr. Blackwood and her colleagues who have studied it intensively. Has the entity been passed along with the photograph itself? Dr. Blackwood admits to experiencing some unusual phenomena since beginning her work on this case. "There have been moments," she says, "particularly when working late in my office, when I felt a presence behind me, and once when reviewing enhanced images of the shadow figure on my computer. The power went out unexpectedly, plunging the room into darkness. In that moment, I distinctly felt something cold brush against my shoulder. Is it possible that by bringing this photograph to light after so many years, Dr. Blackwood has inadvertently released or reawakened the entity contained within it?" The Caldwell funeral photograph remains a mystery that bridges the gap between historical research and paranormal investigation. On one level, it's a document that helps us understand a possible crime from the Victorian era, the poisoning of Jonathan Caldwell by his young wife Elizabeth, who may also have murdered his first wife Margaret. But on another level, it's a window into something far more mysterious and unsettling, an entity that exists in the shadows, attaching itself to those who transgress the boundary between life and death, and perhaps to those who merely witness its image captured in an old photograph. As technology continues to advance, perhaps new methods of analysis will reveal more about the strange figure in the widow's shadow. Until then, the photograph stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things are those that lurk just at the edge of our vision, in the shadows we cast behind us. For now, the photograph has been returned to a secured archive at the Historical Photography Society, where it remains available for study by qualified researchers, though all who view it are warned about its unsettling history. And perhaps, somewhere in the shadows of the archive, a tall, slender figure watches and waits for its next victim. If this story has piqued your interest in historical photography or paranormal phenomena, there are numerous resources available for further exploration. The Historical Photography Society maintains an extensive collection of Victorian-era photographs, including post-mortem portraits similar to the Caldwell funeral photograph. For those interested in the psychological aspects of this case, it's worth noting that many of Elizabeth's experiences could be explained by the effects of guilt and paranoia on a troubled mind. The human brain is remarkably adept at creating supernatural explanations for natural phenomena, especially under the influence of stress or remorse. However, the physical evidence, the anomalous shadow in the photograph, which has been verified by multiple experts, suggests that something beyond psychological explanation may be at work here. As we conclude this investigation, one question remains. What happens to those who have heard this story, who have now become aware of the entity in the widow's shadow? According to some paranormal theories, mere knowledge of such an entity can serve as an invitation. So perhaps the next time you find yourself alone in a dimly lit room, you might want to avoid looking too closely at your own shadow. And if, out of the corner of your eye, you glimpse a tall, slender figure standing just beyond the light's reach, well, now you know what it might be. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Shadow Frames. Remember to like, subscribe, and share, if you dare. Until next time, keep watching the shadows. After the conclusion of our video, a brief postscript. Our research team has continued to investigate the Caldwell case and has uncovered additional information that may be of interest to viewers who have made it to the end of our presentation. The Hammond & Sons photography studio building still exists in Boston's historic district, now housing a modern art gallery. The gallery owner reports frequent electrical disturbances and unexplained cold spots, particularly in the former darkroom area where Edward Hammond would have developed the Caldwell funeral photograph. Several researchers who have handled the original photograph have reported unusual experiences in the weeks following their examination of it. These range from minor occurrences such as unexplained shadows and peripheral vision to more dramatic incidents including sleep paralysis accompanied by the sensation of a presence in the bedroom. Dr. Helen Blackwood herself has installed additional lighting in her home and office since completing her work on the case. When asked about this, she simply stated, "It's better not to take chances." The Caldwell mansion in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood has changed hands numerous times over the decades, with no owner staying longer than 7 years. Current residents report no unusual phenomena, but a building maintenance worker recently discovered a small hidden compartment behind a panel in what was once the parlor where Jonathan Caldwell's body was laid out for his funeral. The compartment contained a single item, a small hand mirror, its reflective surface turned to face the wall. Perhaps most intriguingly, a distant relative of Elizabeth Caldwell came forward after learning of Dr. Blackwood's research. This individual, who asked to remain anonymous, shared a family story about Elizabeth's final years. According to this account, Elizabeth became obsessed with mirrors in her later life, covering or removing all reflective surfaces from her home. She allegedly claimed that mirrors didn't just reflect shadows, they provided another way for it to enter our world. The connection between mirrors and the supernatural exists across numerous cultures. In Western tradition, breaking a mirror is said to bring 7 years of bad luck, possibly related to the ancient belief that mirrors contain fragments of one's soul. In Chinese feng shui, mirrors are used to redirect negative energy. In some vampire lore, the undead cast no reflection because mirrors reflect the soul, and vampires have none. Elizabeth's fear of mirrors might indicate that she had discovered another aspect of the shadow entity, its ability to use reflective surfaces as portals or windows between worlds. Her action of turning the mirror in the hidden compartment to face the wall suggests an attempt to close such a portal, to prevent the entity from entering through that particular gateway. This connection to mirrors might also explain Jonathan's behavior in his final days, carrying a small mirror that he used to look behind him. Rather than a symptom of paranoia, this could have been a deliberate attempt to monitor the entity's movements, to catch glimpses of it in the mirror's reflection when it couldn't be seen directly. Is there any truth to these stories? Are they merely colorful embellishments added to an already mysterious case? Or do they hint at something deeper and more disturbing about the nature of the entity in the widow's shadow? Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain. The boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds have always been more permeable than we might like to believe, and sometimes all it takes to cross that boundary is the click of a camera shutter, capturing something that was never meant to be seen. For Shadow Frames, this is your host, bidding you good night. Sleep well, and try not to think too much about what might be lurking in the darkest corner of your room, watching as you drift off to sleep. Actually, let me hold that thought. We've just received a strange message from one of our viewers who is examining the enhanced image of the Caldwell funeral photograph that we showed earlier in this video. They claim to have noticed something we missed, a second anomalous shadow. this one barely visible behind one of the mourners standing at the far edge of the group. Our team is looking into this claim now, and if verified, we'll cover it in a future episode. Until then, keep your eyes open and your lights on. The shadows are always watching. And cut there. That's our episode on the 1888 funeral photograph. I want to thank our research team for digging up this fascinating case, our production crew for the amazing visual effects, and of course, you, our viewers, for joining us on another journey into the unknown. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to Shadow Frames for more content like this, and don't forget to ring the notification bell so you'll know immediately when we release our next investigation. Your support helps us continue bringing these mysterious stories to light. And remember, sometimes the most terrifying things are hiding in plain sight, just waiting for someone to notice them. So keep watching the shadows, and we'll see you next time. In the month since our initial investigation into the Caldwell funeral photograph, we've received numerous messages from viewers sharing their own encounters with unexplained shadows. While most can be attributed to natural phenomena or the power of suggestion after watching our video, a few stand out for their similarity to Elizabeth Caldwell's experiences. A museum curator in Edinburgh wrote to describe how, after handling a collection of Victorian post-mortem photographs, she began noticing a tall, slender shadow in her peripheral vision. This phenomenon continued for several weeks before abruptly stopping when she transferred the photographs to a different department. A retired physician in Vancouver reported experiencing cold spots and unexplained shadows in his home after purchasing an antique camera that had once belonged to a Victorian-era photographer known for funeral portraits. The disturbances ceased when he sold the camera to a collector. Most compelling was a message from a librarian in Boston who had been researching the Caldwell family for an unrelated historical project. She described waking one night to find her bedroom filled with shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. In the corner of the room, she glimpsed a tall figure with unusually long arms and an elongated head. The experience was so terrifying that she immediately abandoned her research on the Caldwells. Could these incidents be connected to our investigation? Is there something about the Caldwell case specifically, or about Victorian post-mortem photography more generally, that attracts or activates these shadow entities? Or is it simply that, once primed by our story, people become more attuned to the shadows around them, more likely to notice or imagine strange phenomena? The human mind is remarkably susceptible to suggestion, particularly when it comes to the perception of vague or ambiguous stimuli. Once we become aware of a particular pattern or possibility, we tend to notice instances that conform to that pattern, even when they might otherwise have gone unnoticed, a psychological phenomenon known as confirmation bias. Yet the consistency of these reports, the specific details that recur across independent accounts, suggests something more than mere suggestion at work. There may be a genuine phenomenon underlying these experiences, whether supernatural in nature or as yet unexplained by conventional science. For those who find themselves drawn to further investigation of shadow entities, we offer this caution. Be mindful of the doors you may be opening. If there is truth to the theory that awareness itself can serve as an invitation to these entities, then pursuit of this knowledge may carry its own risks. Our team continues to research historical cases similar to the Caldwell photograph, looking for patterns that might shed light on the nature of these shadow phenomena. We're particularly interested in other Victorian-era photographs that might contain similar anomalies, as well as accounts from that period describing experiences like Elizabeth's. The Victorian fascination with death and the afterlife, combined with the then new technology of photography, created a unique cultural moment when the boundaries between the living and the dead, the natural and supernatural, seemed particularly permeable. Perhaps it is no coincidence that reports of shadow entities became more common during this period, as if the very act of capturing and fixing shadows through photography somehow gave these entities greater purchase in our world. As we delve deeper into these mysteries, we remain committed to approaching them with both skepticism and an open mind. We will continue to seek rational explanations for seemingly supernatural phenomena, while acknowledging that there may be aspects of reality that lie beyond our current understanding. Until our next investigation, we encourage you to stay curious, stay skeptical, and above all, stay vigilant. The shadows are always with us, but what lurks within them remains, for now, a matter of speculation and wonder. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the unknown. This is Shadow Frames, signing off. In 1888, photography was still a relatively new technology, having been widely available for only a few decades. The daguerreotype, introduced in 1839, had given way to newer processes that made photography more accessible to the public, but it was still considered somewhat mysterious by many people. Post-mortem photography had become a common practice by this time, especially among the middle and upper classes who could afford the expense. For families who had never had a photograph taken during a loved one's life, a funeral portrait might be the only image they would ever have to remember them by. The Victorian era was marked by elaborate mourning rituals and a fascination with death. Queen Victoria herself had set the standard after the death of her husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, wearing black for the remaining 40 years of her life. This period saw the rise of mourning jewelry, often containing locks of hair from the deceased, and other memento mori that kept the memory of the dead close at hand.